The auction of a life. The room was suffocating, heavy with the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey. Golden chandeliers cast a dim glow over the lavish hall, illuminating a sea of well-dressed men lounging in plush leather chairs, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Ellie Hayes stood on the elevated stage, her heart pounding so violently she feared they could hear it. She had known desperation before, hunger, loneliness, the sting of rejection from yet another foster home. But this was different. This was powerlessness. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the grand hall, polished and indifferent. Lot 19, an exquisite young woman. 19 years old, untouched, a rare find, gentlemen. Ellie's stomach twisted. Her nails dug into her palms. She had been dragged into this nightmare against her will, a victim of a debt she never owed. Her so-called guardian, a man who had taken her in when she was 15, had sold her to pay his gambling debts. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run. But she could do none of those things. Not here. Not now. A murmur of approval spread through the crowd as the bidding began. Numbers flew through the air, rising higher and higher as the men competed, their gazes hungry. 5 million. 7. 10. Ellie kept her chin up, refusing to let them see her fear. But her body trembled as she met the eyes of each bidder. They didn't see her as a person, only as a prize. Then, a new voice cut through the noise, deeper, colder. 50 million. Silence fell. Even the auctioneer hesitated. Whispers rippled through the room. No one dared to challenge the offer. Ellie's gaze shifted toward the man who had spoken. He sat in the shadows, effortlessly commanding the room. The glow of the chandeliers barely touched him, but she could still see the sharp angles of his face, the steel-gray eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. Roman Lancaster. She had heard his name before. One of the wealthiest, most ruthless businessmen in the country. He was the kind of man people feared. And now he owned her. The auctioneer cleared his throat and slammed the gavel down. Sold. A shudder ran through Ellie. Reality settled over her. This man had bought her as easily as he would a luxury car or a rare piece of art. But why? As the guards led her off the stage, she stole one last glance at Roman Lancaster. His expression was unreadable, his posture relaxed, as if this were just another business transaction. Ellie wasn't sure what was worse, the men who had openly ogled her or the one who had claimed her without emotion. She swallowed hard. Whatever he wanted from her, she wasn't going to give in without a fight. The ride to the unknown. The car ride was silent. The tension was thick as Ellie sat stiffly in the back seat, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. The city lights blurred past, giving way to the endless darkness of the highway. She had no idea where she was being taken, only that she was leaving behind one nightmare and stepping into another. Roman Lancaster sat beside her, quiet and unreadable. The weight of his presence filled the car, suffocating and cold. He didn't glance at her, didn't acknowledge her. She should have been relieved. Instead, the silence made her skin crawl. Finally, the car pulled through an enormous iron gate, winding up a long driveway toward a sprawling mansion. The estate was breathtaking. Marble columns, towering windows, perfectly manicured gardens. But there was something eerily lifeless about it, like a museum exhibit, beautiful but untouched. The driver opened the door, but Ellie didn't move. She felt like a prisoner arriving at her cell. Out, a deep voice commanded. Roman Lancaster stood beside the car, his posture unreadable, his gaze sharp and assessing. He had barely spoken since the auction, and now, as she hesitated, something flickered in his eyes. Impatience, maybe amusement. Ellie lifted her chin and stepped out. She would not cower. Inside, the mansion was just as cold as it looked. Everything was pristine, expensive, calculated. Not a single object felt personal. No family photos. No warmth. Just vast, empty perfection. "This will be your room." Roman's voice was clipped, businesslike, as he led her to a suite larger than any place she had ever lived. The king-sized bed was draped in silk sheets. A crystal chandelier hung overhead. The massive window overlooked the ocean. Ellie turned to him, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "What do you expect from me?" Roman's expression remained impassive. "Nothing. For now." The words should have reassured her. They didn't. There was an edge to them, something unreadable in his tone. Then, just as he turned to leave, he dropped a bombshell. "You're not to leave the estate." Ellie's heart pounded. She clenched her jaw. "He thinks he can cage me. He's wrong." The door clicked shut behind him. She exhaled slowly, her mind already racing. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But one thing was certain. She would escape. The golden cage. Ellie stared at the heavy wooden door that had just closed behind Roman Lancaster, her heart still pounding against her ribs. The silence in the massive bedroom was deafening, pressing in on her like an invisible force. The weight of her situation finally settled over her. She wasn't just bought. She was trapped. Her fingers curled into fists as she took slow, deep breaths, willing herself to stay calm. Panic would do her no good. This room, though luxurious, was nothing more than a prison. A gilded cage lined with silk sheets and expensive chandeliers. "Think, Ellie, think." She turned slowly, taking in every detail. The room was enormous, decorated in soft creams and golds, the kind of space most people would envy. But to Ellie, it was nothing but suffocating. She walked to the massive window, fingers brushing against the cold glass. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the estate's manicured gardens, its surface silver under the moonlight. A tall iron fence lined the property, cutting off any path to freedom. Below, security guards patrolled the grounds, their movements sharp and calculated. Of course, he has security. Ellie clenched her jaw. Whatever Roman Lancaster had planned for her, he wasn't going to let her simply walk away. She needed to learn everything she could about this place, its exits, its security, its weaknesses. If there was a way out, she would find it. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. Before she could respond, the door opened, and a woman in her late 40s stepped inside. Her posture was stiff, her expression unreadable. "Miss Hayes, my name is Martha. I manage the household." Her voice was clipped, professional. She carried a folded dress over her arm, the fabric flowing like liquid under the dim chandelier light. "Dinner will be served in 20 minutes. Mr. Lancaster expects you to join him." Ellie lifted her chin. "And if I refuse?" Martha didn't so much as blink. "That is not an option." Ellie exhaled sharply. Of course, it wasn't. The woman placed the dress on the bed, turned on her heel, and left without another word. Ellie stared after her. "So that's how this works. I'm not a person. I'm an expectation." Her gaze flickered back to the dress. It was elegant, deep sapphire in color, a stark contrast against her pale skin. She didn't want to wear it, didn't want to play whatever game Roman Lancaster was setting up. But she needed information. If dinner would give her a chance to observe him, to understand what he wanted, then fine. She would play along. For now, the man across the table. Ellie stepped into the dining room with slow, deliberate steps. Roman Lancaster sat at the head of a long mahogany table, dressed in a crisp black suit. His presence alone commanded the room, even in silence. The moment his eyes met hers, something flickered in them. Surprise? Amusement. It was gone before she could decipher it. A butler pulled out a chair for her at the other end of the table. The distance between them felt intentional, like a battle line drawn between two opposing forces. Ellie sat without a word, her back straight, her expression carefully guarded. The meal was already served, something delicate and gourmet, plated like a piece of art. Ellie didn't touch it. Roman, however, took a sip of his wine, watching her over the rim of his glass. "You don't eat." Ellie met his gaze without flinching. I don't trust food prepared by people who think they own me. A ghost of a smirk tugged at his lips. Paranoid. She tilted her head. Realistic. Silence settled between them, heavy and charged. Ellie studied him in the dim candlelight. Roman Lancaster was a man carved from stone, controlled, precise, impossible to read. But there was something beneath the surface, something deeper than the cold exterior he projected. A man like him didn't spend $50 million on something without a reason. Finally, she spoke. What do you want from me? Roman set his glass down. Marriage. The word hit her like a slap. Ellie stiffened, her hands curling into fists under the table. Excuse me. Roman leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I need a wife. You were? Convenient. Her stomach twisted. Convenient. Like a business acquisition. Like a property purchase. Like an object. So you bought one, she said, her voice dripping with bitterness. Must be nice, solving your problems with money. It's efficient. Ellie exhaled sharply, her temper barely restrained. And if I say no? Roman's gaze darkened slightly. You don't get to say no, Ellie. Something cold ran down her spine. You can fight me, if you want. He continued, swirling the wine in his glass. You can make this as difficult as you like, but the end result will be the same. Her nails dug into her palms. And when this marriage is over, what happens to me then? Roman's expression remained unreadable. That depends on you. Ellie's chest ached with the weight of her reality. She was caged, with no way out. Not yet, anyway. The prison without bars. Days passed, then a week. Ellie learned the layout of the mansion, memorized the movements of the security guards. She listened. She observed. Roman was a ghost in his own home. He worked long hours, often vanishing behind the heavy doors of his study. The staff moved like shadows, discreet and efficient, trained to be invisible. It was a world built on silence. But Ellie wasn't silent. She explored when no one was looking. She tested locked doors. She mapped out escape routes. Every time she passed the grand staircase leading to the front entrance, she felt it. The temptation, the pull of the outside world. But she wasn't stupid. This wasn't just about breaking out of a house. This was about outsmarting a man who was always 10 steps ahead. One mistake, and she would never get another chance. Then, one night, she found something unexpected. A locked door at the end of the east wing. Unlike the others, this one wasn't part of the grand architecture. It was reinforced, hidden. Ellie frowned. She reached for the handle. Locked. Her heart pounded. What was Roman Lancaster hiding? And was it the key to her freedom? Secrets behind locked doors. Ellie stared at the locked door, her pulse hammering in her throat. It was different from the rest, reinforced, concealed at the end of the east wing where no one seemed to go. It wasn't just a room. It was a secret. And secrets meant leverage. Her fingers brushed against the handle, testing it again. Still locked. She glanced over her shoulder, listening for footsteps. The mansion was silent, wrapped in the hush of midnight. The staff was gone for the evening, and the security guards wouldn't patrol this wing for another 15 minutes. This was her chance. Taking a slow breath, Ellie turned away and walked quickly back to her room. She needed a plan, the key to the puzzle. The next morning, Ellie sat in the sunroom, sipping the coffee that Martha had left for her. The warm morning light streamed in through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. She had learned a lot in the past week. Roman Lancaster ran his estate like a machine, efficient, calculated, and controlled. His staff followed strict routines. His security team rotated shifts with military precision. And yet, that one door in the east wing stood out. It wasn't part of the careful order. It was hidden, which meant it was important. Ellie knew she had to get inside. But for that, she needed the key. And Roman Lancaster wasn't the kind of man who left things unguarded. She set her coffee down and exhaled. If the key wasn't hidden in the main rooms, it had to be somewhere more personal, which meant her heart pounded. Roman's study. A dangerous game. Ellie didn't wait. That afternoon, while Roman was handling business in the city, she slipped past the watchful eyes of the staff and made her way toward his study. The heavy mahogany doors loomed before her. She hesitated only for a second before slipping inside. The room smelled of rich leather and aged whiskey. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with novels and ledgers. A marble fireplace stood unused, its surface pristine. Everything in the study was perfectly placed, organized, calculated, just like him. Ellie moved quickly. She checked the desk drawers first. Locked. The shelves. Nothing. Her gaze flickered to the whiskey cabinet. She walked over, trailing her fingers across the collection of expensive bottles. And then, her hand stopped. A small silver key sat beside a crystal decanter. Her breath hitched. This is it. Fingers trembling, she picked it up, slipping it into her pocket just as the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Ellie froze. She had expected to have more time. The door handle turned. She barely had time to react before Roman walked in. His eyes landed on her immediately. Ellie forced herself to stay calm, leaning casually against the desk. "You're back early." Roman didn't reply. His gaze swept over her, sharp and unreadable. "What are you doing in my study?" Ellie's pulse raced, but she met his gaze with steady defiance. "Just looking around." "I was bored." Silence stretched between them. Roman took a slow step forward. "Bored?" She shrugged. "Well, it's not like you let me go anywhere." His jaw tensed. "You shouldn't be in here." Ellie lifted a brow. "And yet, here I am." Roman exhaled, running a hand through his hair, his patience clearly thinning. "Ellie." She tilted her head. "What, afraid I'll find something?" A dangerous look flickered across his face. "You're playing a game you don't understand." Ellie's heart pounded, but she didn't back down. "Then enlighten me, Roman. What exactly am I to you?" His lips pressed into a thin line. And for a moment, something in his expression cracked. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked past her, pouring himself a drink from the decanter. His movements were slow, deliberate, controlled, except for the way his grip tightened around the glass. Ellie exhaled, forcing herself to relax. She had what she came for. Now she just needed to use it. The secret room. That night, Ellie waited until the house was silent. She slipped from her bed, the silver key burning in her pocket as she made her way to the east wing. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step bringing her closer to whatever secret Roman was hiding. Finally, she reached the door. She took a slow, shaky breath and slid the key into the lock. Flick. The door creaked open. The room beyond was dark. Ellie stepped inside, her fingers fumbling along the wall until she found the light switch. Her breath caught. This wasn't just a room. It was a shrine. The walls were covered in photographs. Newspapers. Documents. Ellie moved closer, her fingers tracing the edges of a picture pinned to the wall. It was of her. Her stomach twisted. There were others. Pictures of her from years ago. Her high school graduation. Her job at the bookstore. Even candid shots of her walking home at night. Roman Lancaster had been watching her. For years. A cold wave of dread washed over her. This wasn't random. This wasn't just a business deal. He had chosen her, deliberately. Her hands trembled as she reached for one of the files stacked neatly on the desk. It had her name on it. She flipped it open, scanning the pages. And then she saw it. A legal document. Her breath hitched. Roman Lancaster hadn't just bought her. He had planned this, long before the auction. Her entire life. Her debt, her disappearance, even the foster system that had failed her. It all led back to him. A noise behind her made her spin around. Roman stood in the doorway. His face was unreadable. But his eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. You weren't supposed to see that. Ellie's blood ran cold. She had just uncovered the truth. And now she wasn't sure she would ever leave this house alive. The truth behind the shadows. Ellie's pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at Roman standing in the doorway. His face was carefully blank, but his steel-gray eyes held something dangerous, something unreadable. She had expected anger, rage, maybe even a threat. But Roman Lancaster was eerily calm. Too calm. You weren't supposed to see that, he repeated, his voice softer this time, controlled. Ellie took a slow step back, her fingers tightening around the folder in her hands. Her mind was spinning, piecing together everything she had just uncovered. The auction hadn't been random. The debt hadn't been coincidental. Roman had orchestrated it all. Why? Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak. You planned this. Roman exhaled, stepping inside, closing the door behind him. The lock clicked into place, trapping them together. Ellie's stomach twisted. Explain, she demanded, her nails digging into her palms. Explain why my entire life, my debt, my past, my existence, is in this room. Roman stared at her for a long moment. Then, with the kind of certainty that sent chills down her spine, he said, "Because you belong to me." Ellie's breath hitched. She shook her head, gripping the folder tighter. That's not an answer. Roman walked to the desk, unbuttoning the cuffs of his shirt with slow, measured movements. Do you really think I spend $50 million on accidents? Ellie stiffened. You manipulated my life to force me into this arrangement. Roman's gaze met hers. No. A pause. I saved you from something much worse. She let out a bitter laugh. Save me. She threw the folder onto the desk, the papers spilling across the dark wood. This looks a lot more like ownership than protection. Roman's jaw tensed, but he didn't deny it. Ellie's mind raced. If this wasn't about business, if she wasn't just some random auction girl, then what was she? Why her? She took another step back. Let me go, she whispered. Roman's eyes darkened. No. Silence stretched between them, suffocating. Then, Ellie whispered the question that had been burning inside her since the moment she had walked into this room. Who am I to you? Roman's entire body went still. The air between them thickened, charged with something neither of them could name. Ellie swallowed. You could have bought anyone that night, but you chose me. You planned this. Why? Roman exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, the cold, calculated mask he always wore cracked. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different. Softer. Raw. You were mine before you even knew my name. Ellie's breath caught. She stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. Roman turned, his fingers grazing over the photographs on the wall. You don't remember, do you? Ellie frowned. Remember what? He closed his eyes for a brief second before speaking again. A long time ago, when you were a child, you saved someone's life. A boy. You probably don't even remember it. But I do. Ellie's heartbeat stuttered. What? I was that boy, Roman murmured. And from that day on, I swore I would never let anything happen to you. Ellie's chest tightened. That doesn't make sense. Your life was never an accident to me, Ellie. She sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers trembling at her sides. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. That night at the auction, Roman continued, I wasn't saving you from me. I was saving you from men who would have destroyed you. Ellie shook her head. You bought me. You kept me trapped in this house. Roman's gaze darkened. Because if I hadn't, someone else would have. And they wouldn't have been so generous. Ellie felt the air leave her lungs. You were never supposed to end up on that stage, Roman said, his voice quieter now. Your debt wasn't yours to pay. It was a setup. Someone wanted to sell you, and I wanted to stop it. Her mind reeled. Roman wasn't lying. She could feel it in the way he spoke, the way his usually cold expression flickered with something raw and real. She thought back to the day she was taken, the way her so-called guardian had looked at her with pity, regret, and something close to fear. Had Roman been the lesser evil all along? She swallowed hard. If I was never supposed to end up on that stage, then who wanted me there? Roman's jaw tightened. You already know the answer. Ellie's blood ran cold. Dean. She had seen the way Roman's brother looked at her, calculating, predatory, as if she was something fragile that could be broken and tossed aside. She suddenly felt sick. Roman studied her, waiting for the realization to sink in. You have every reason to hate me, Ellie, he murmured. But if you want the truth, he stepped closer, his voice like a quiet storm. Hate me later. Right now, I need you to trust me. Ellie's hands trembled. Everything she thought she knew was unraveling. Her entire life had been tangled in Roman Lancaster's web long before she ever met him. And now, the real question wasn't whether she could escape. It was whether she wanted to. Because for the first time, she wasn't so sure. A truth too heavy to bear. Ellie's breath came fast, uneven. The walls of the hidden room seemed to close in around her as the weight of Roman's words settled over her like a suffocating fog. He had known her. Not for weeks, not from the auction, but for years. And she had no idea. Her hands trembled as she stepped back, away from him, away from the photographs and documents that told a story she wasn't ready to understand. She swallowed, her voice unsteady. You're lying. Roman's expression didn't change. I don't lie, Ellie. Her mind raced. She searched for any memories, any moment in her past where a young Roman Lancaster could have been. She had lived through so much: foster homes, temporary shelters, long nights in places that never felt safe. How could she have saved someone like him? I don't remember you, she whispered. Roman exhaled, stepping closer. I know. His voice was quieter now, as if admitting that fact to himself. You were 11 years old. It was winter. Ellie's heart lurched. Winter. She had always hated winter. She blinked as a flicker of a memory stirred, cold air burning her lungs, the distant sound of car horns, an alleyway lit by a flickering street lamp. And a boy. Thin, bruised, bleeding. Ellie's pulse pounded. No, she murmured, shaking her head. That wasn't you. Roman's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. It was. Her vision blurred. She did remember that night. She had been walking back to the shelter after sneaking out to find food. It had been freezing, her breath turning to mist in the air. And then she had seen him. A boy, barely older than her, leaning against the brick wall of an alley, his lips split, his eyes swollen shut. She had hesitated only for a second before running to him, dragging him to his feet. You can't stay here, she had told him. They'll find you. She had no idea who they were, only that the fear in his eyes had been too real to ignore. She had given him her scarf, had pressed the few dollars she had into his palm, had told him to run before whoever had hurt him came back. And then, just as quickly as she had found him, she had left. She had never thought about him again. Until now. Ellie looked up at Roman, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. That was you. His throat bobbed as he nodded. Ellie felt dizzy. This doesn't make sense, she whispered. You're Roman Lancaster. Your family was rich. Why would you be? Because money doesn't protect you from the people inside your own home. The words were so quiet, so simple, but they hit her like a blade. Roman's gaze flickered to the side, his fingers flexing at his sides. My father had his own way of making sure we earned our place in the family business, he said, voice devoid of emotion. And when I was 13, I learned what happened to people who disappointed him. Ellie felt her stomach drop. He sent me away, Roman continued, his voice hollow. Took everything. threw me to the streets for a week with nothing but the clothes on my back. If I found my way home, I was strong enough to be his son. If I didn't, he let the sentence hang. Ellie swallowed, horror settling in her bones. She had met him then, at his lowest, and she had saved him. A cold realization seeped into her veins. "Is that why you did this?" she whispered. "Because you felt like you owed me." Roman's eyes darkened. "No," she scoffed, bitter. "Then what?" "You felt guilty. Decided to repay some debt by buying me." Roman's nostrils flared. "You think I planned this out of guilt?" Ellie shook her head. "I don't know what to think, Roman. I was dragged into an auction, sold like a piece of property, and now you're telling me you've been watching me my whole life, that I saved you." Her voice cracked, but she didn't care. "How do you expect me to believe this?" Roman exhaled harshly, running a hand through his hair. "Because it's the truth." Ellie let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. "You manipulated my life." His eyes darkened. "I protected it." Her stomach twisted. "You don't get to decide what I need protection from." Roman's jaw tensed. "I do when people are trying to hurt you." Ellie froze. She took a slow step back. "What?" Roman's gaze sharpened. "You really think your so-called guardian racked up millions in debt on his own?" Ellie's heart pounded. "What are you saying?" Roman's voice dropped. "Someone wanted you to be sold." A cold shiver ran down her spine. She had spent years believing her guardian had been nothing more than a greedy, pathetic gambler who had made a terrible mistake, that her life had been collateral damage. But what if that wasn't true? Roman took another step closer. "The night of the auction wasn't an accident, Ellie. Someone arranged for you to be there." Her blood turned to ice. Ellie's thoughts spiraled, trying to make sense of it all. "Who?" she whispered. Roman's expression was grim. "Dean." Ellie staggered back as if he had struck her. "No," she said, shaking her head. He doesn't even know me." "He knows more than you think." Roman's voice was calm, but his fists were clenched. "He's been watching you for years." Ellie's breath came faster. "That doesn't make sense. Why would he?" Roman exhaled sharply. "Because I told him about you." Ellie went still. Roman's gaze darkened, filled with something unreadable. "Years ago, when I finally took back my place in the family business, Dean asked me how I survived when our father threw me out. I told him about you." Ellie felt cold all over. Roman's jaw tensed. "I thought I was safe telling him. That it didn't matter anymore." He let out a bitter chuckle. "I should have known better." Ellie felt dizzy. "Dean saw you as leverage," Roman continued. "The one thing that ever made me vulnerable." Her vision blurred. Leverage. She wasn't just sold. She had been hunted. Ellie backed up until she hit the desk, her fingers gripping the edge to steady herself. "This is insane," she whispered. "This is." "I know," Roman said quietly. Ellie's mind raced. Dean. The auction. The way everything had been orchestrated to trap her in Roman's world. Roman took another step toward her. "Ellie." She didn't move. Couldn't. His fingers brushed against her chin, tilting her face up until her gaze locked onto his. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. "I don't expect you to trust me," he murmured. "Not yet." Ellie swallowed. "But if you want the truth," Roman continued, "I need you to stay." Ellie's chest tightened. Stay. Her body screamed at her to run, to fight. But deep down, she already knew the answer. She wasn't running. Not yet. Because if she wanted to survive this, she needed to know everything. The deal with the devil. Ellie sat in the grand library of Roman Lancaster's estate, her mind a battlefield of chaos. The room was silent except for the occasional crackling of the fireplace, its warmth doing little to thaw the ice running through her veins. Dean. The name tasted bitter on her tongue. He had orchestrated everything. Her guardian hadn't simply sold her off in a desperate attempt to clear his debts. He had been manipulated into it, pushed, placed, by Dean Lancaster, Roman's brother. Her fingers clenched around the armrests of the leather chair. Roman watched her from across the room, leaning against the heavy wooden desk, his gaze unreadable. His presence filled the space, a silent force that demanded attention. Ellie exhaled slowly, meeting his eyes. "Why tell me now?" Roman's jaw tightened. "Because you need to understand what's at stake." She let out a bitter laugh. "You mean now that I know too much?" He didn't deny it. Ellie ran a hand through her hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. "So what? You want me to just accept this? Accept that your brother set me up, that you've been watching me for years, that I was never supposed to have a choice?" Roman exhaled. "You do have a choice now." She scoffed. "Do I?" His gaze darkened. "If you leave, Dean will find you." Ellie swallowed hard. She knew that already. Dean Lancaster was not a man to be underestimated. If he had planned this for years, he wouldn't simply let her walk away. But staying here, with Roman? Ellie stood abruptly, pacing toward the window. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, dark and restless, just like the war raging inside her. "I don't trust you," she admitted quietly. Roman's voice was calm when he replied, "I don't expect you to." Ellie turned to face him, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Then what do you expect?" Roman pushed off the desk, stepping toward her with slow, deliberate movements. "I expect you to survive." Ellie's breath caught. Roman's voice dropped lower, filled with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Dean isn't done, Ellie. He's not the type to accept failure. He lost you once. He won't make that mistake again." Ellie swallowed. Roman continued, "The only way to stop him is to take away his leverage." Her stomach twisted. "And how do we do that?" Roman met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "We get married." Silence. Ellie blinked. "I'd what?" Roman didn't flinch. "It's the only way to protect you." She let out a breathless laugh. "That's insane." "Is it?" He tilted his head slightly. "Dean only wants you because he sees you as mine. If you become my wife, he loses the ability to touch you without consequences." Ellie shook her head. "You think a marriage certificate will stop him?" Roman's gaze darkened. "Not just a marriage certificate." He took another step closer. "A legal contract. One that binds you to me in a way that makes you untouchable." Ellie's pulse pounded. "Think about it, Ellie," Roman continued. "If you leave now, Dean will find you. He'll have you exactly where he wants you, with no protection, no power, no way to fight back." She hated that he was right, but she also hated the alternative. A marriage. With Roman Lancaster. She crossed her arms tighter, as if it could somehow shield her from the weight of this decision. "And what do you get out of this?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Roman's lips twitched in the faintest hint of amusement. "The pleasure of keeping you alive." Ellie scowled. "Bullshit." He didn't deny it. Instead, he exhaled slowly. "There are people in my business who expect me to settle down. Marriage gives me leverage in ways you don't understand. It makes me look stable, secure, like a man with something to protect." Ellie narrowed her eyes. "And what happens when this little arrangement is over?" Roman held her gaze. "Then you'll be free." Ellie stared at him. "You expect me to believe that?" Roman's expression was unreadable. "Believe whatever you want, Ellie. But this is your best chance at survival." Her breath came faster. This was insane. Every part of her screamed to fight, to reject the idea, to run. But Roman was right about one thing. Dean Lancaster wasn't finished with her. And if she left now, she wouldn't survive him. Ellie exhaled sharply, staring at the man in front of her. A man she didn't trust. A man who had bought her, manipulated her, trapped her in his world. But also, a man who had saved her. a man who was offering her the only way out. She clenched her jaw. "Fine," she said, voice steady. "I'll marry you." Roman's gaze flickered with something unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. "Good choice." Ellie's stomach twisted. She had just made a deal with the devil. And now, there was no turning back. A vow written in blood. The night before the wedding, Ellie stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of her bedroom, staring out at the ocean. The waves crashed against the shore, rhythmic and violent, mirroring the storm inside her. Tomorrow, she would no longer be Ellie Hayes. She would be Eleanor Lancaster. The name felt foreign on her tongue, an identity that wasn't hers. But then again, nothing about her life belonged to her anymore. Behind her, the door creaked open. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Roman. His presence was heavy, the air shifting with the weight of his arrival. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he walked to the bar on the far side of the room and poured himself a drink. The sound of liquid splashing against glass echoed through the silence. Finally, he spoke. "Are you afraid?" Ellie scoffed, crossing her arms. "That's a stupid question." Roman smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "And yet, you agreed to this." Ellie turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I agreed because I didn't have a choice." Roman's gaze met hers, something flickering behind his gray eyes. "There's always a choice, Ellie." She exhaled sharply. "Not for people like me." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Roman set his drink down and walked toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. "Tomorrow," he said, stopping just a foot away, "everything changes." Ellie held her ground. "I know." His gaze flickered over her face, searching. "Are you ready?" She lifted her chin. "Are you?" His lips curved slightly, though there was no humor in it. "I don't think either of us are." Ellie swallowed. The truth was, she didn't know if she was ready. But ready or not, this was happening. Roman studied her for a moment before exhaling. "Get some rest." She didn't respond, and he didn't wait for one. Instead, he turned and walked out, leaving her alone with the weight of her future. Ellie clenched her fists. Tomorrow, she would belong to him, but only for as long as it took to escape. The wedding of no love. Ellie had never imagined her wedding day would be like this. There was no chapel, no music, no family. Just a cold exchange of words in the Lancaster estate's private office, where a judge sat before them, flipping through a stack of papers. Roman stood beside her, composed and unreadable in his tailored black suit. He looked effortless, like this was just another business deal. Which, for him, it was. Ellie, on the other hand, felt suffocated. The dress she wore had been chosen by one of Roman's assistants, a sleek white gown with lace detailing. Elegant but impersonal. The ring on her finger, an expensive diamond set in platinum, was heavy. It was all for show. A performance. A contract signed in ink, but bound in steel. "Do you, Roman Lancaster, take Eleanor Hayes as your lawful wife?" Roman didn't hesitate. "I do." Ellie's stomach twisted. "And do you, Eleanor Hayes, take Roman Lancaster as your lawful husband?" She could feel Roman's eyes on her, waiting for her to seal her fate. Ellie inhaled sharply, forcing the words out. "I do." The judge nodded, scribbling something on the documents. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The words barely registered. Then, suddenly, Roman turned to her. And before Ellie could react, he leaned in and pressed a kiss to her lips. It was quick, chaste. But even in that fleeting moment, she felt it. The power, the control, the claim. When he pulled away, his expression remained unreadable, but his grip on her waist lingered for a second longer than necessary. Ellie clenched her fists. She hated him. She hated the way he always seemed to win. She hated the way her body reacted to his touch, betraying her. Applause filled the room from the few business associates who had attended, their voices blending into a dull hum in her ears. It was done. She was his. And there was no escaping now. A wedding night of lies. The bedroom was dark, lit only by the soft glow of the moon outside the window. Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched in her lap. She could hear the distant sounds of the staff clearing the remains of the celebration downstairs. And then, footsteps. The door creaked open. Roman. Ellie stiffened as he stepped inside, his presence heavy in the quiet room. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he walked to the bar and poured himself another drink, just like he had the night before. Finally, he turned to her. "You're not afraid," he observed. Ellie met his gaze. "I told you before, Roman. Fear is a luxury I can't afford." His lips twitched, but he didn't smile. "Then tell me, Eleanor." His voice dropped lower, rougher. "What can you afford?" Ellie swallowed, her pulse picking up. She knew what he was asking, what he expected. This was their wedding night, after all. But this wasn't a marriage built on love. It wasn't built on trust, either. It was built on a contract. Nothing more. She stood slowly, lifting her chin. "I can afford not to play your game." Roman's eyes darkened. Ellie took a step closer, her voice steady. "You said this was a business deal. That I was a necessity, not a wife." She tilted her head. "Did you lie?" Roman exhaled, setting his drink down. "I don't lie, Ellie." She studied him. "Then you don't need this." Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Finally, Roman stepped back. "No," he said simply. "I don't." Ellie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Roman turned toward the door. "Your room is yours," he said. "Mine is down the hall." Ellie's stomach twisted, just like that. He glanced at her, just like that. And then, without another word, he was gone. Ellie let out a shaky breath. She had won. For now. But the battle had only just begun. A war of hearts and power. Days passed. Then weeks. Ellie played her role as the perfect wife in public, standing beside Roman at business events, smiling when necessary, wearing the mask of a woman in love. But behind closed doors, they were strangers. And yet, something was changing. Roman wasn't as indifferent as he pretended to be. She caught the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his fingers twitched when someone got too close to her, the way he clenched his jaw whenever Dean's name was mentioned. Something was happening. Something neither of them could control. And Ellie wasn't sure which was more terrifying. The danger that still lurked in the shadows, or the fire that was slowly starting to burn between them. Because if she wasn't careful, she might just fall for the man who had caged her. And that would be the biggest mistake of all. A love born from war. Ellie had spent weeks trying to untangle the mess of her life. She had been auctioned off, thrown into the clutches of Roman Lancaster, and forced into a marriage that was never meant to be real. And yet, everything had changed. The man she had thought was her captor had become her shield. The enemy she had once feared had become her protector. But none of that mattered if Dean Lancaster still had his hands in the shadows. And Roman knew it. He stood by the window of his study, his gaze locked on the dark horizon. Ellie leaned against the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. "How long do you think we have before he makes his next move?" she asked. Roman exhaled slowly. "Not long." Ellie's stomach twisted. They had been playing defense for too long, waiting for Dean to make a mistake. But Dean wasn't the kind of man who made mistakes. He was calculated, cruel. Roman turned to her, his gaze sharp. "I'm not letting him take you." Ellie lifted her chin. "I know." A muscle ticked in his jaw. This was never supposed to happen. Ellie tilted her head. "Which part?" Roman's expression flickered, just for a second, with something raw. "You." Ellie's heart clenched. "You didn't expect to care about me." Roman hesitated. Then, quietly, "No." Ellie swallowed hard. She knew what this was. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was something worse. It was real. "Then don't lose me," she whispered. Roman didn't blink. "I won't." The next morning, the war began. The fall of Dean Lancaster. Ellie had seen men like Dean before. People who thrived on control, who manipulated others like pieces on a chessboard, thinking they were untouchable. But even kings could be toppled. Roman had made sure of it. He had spent the past week moving silently, gathering evidence, calling in favors from men who owed him. And now, it was time to strike. The Lancaster family estate was packed with politicians, business executives, and power-hungry men who had no idea that, by the end of the night, their alliances would mean nothing. Ellie stood beside Roman, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She could feel the tension rolling off of him, but outwardly, he was calm. Dean approached them with his usual arrogance, his smirk in place. "Brother," he greeted, his eyes flickering to Ellie. "And my lovely sister-in-law. You look radiant as always." Ellie forced a tight smile. "Dean." Dean glanced at Roman. "Enjoying married life, I take it." Roman's expression didn't change. "Actually, I'm enjoying destroying you." Dean's smirk faltered. Roman pulled a small flash drive from his pocket, holding it up between two fingers. "This contains every illegal deal you've made, every bribe, every backroom conversation you thought no one recorded." Dean's expression darkened. "You're bluffing." Roman's smirk was deadly. "Am I?" Dean's gaze flickered around the room. Several men were watching them now, whispers spreading. Roman leaned in slightly. "The moment I hand this over to the right people, you'll lose everything. Your assets, your contacts, your freedom." Dean clenched his jaw. "You wouldn't." Roman's voice was ice. "I would." Ellie watched as panic flickered across Dean's face. It lasted only a second before his arrogance returned. "Fine," he said. "What do you want?" Roman didn't hesitate. "Your exile." Dean stiffened. "You disappear," Roman continued. "No money, no power, no way to crawl your way back up." His eyes were deadly. "Or I bury you myself." Dean swallowed. Then, finally, he laughed. It was humorless, bitter. "You win, brother." Roman's expression didn't change. Dean exhaled, shaking his head. "You always do." With that, he turned and walked away. And just like that, the war was over. The truth of it all. Ellie sat on the balcony of their private villa, staring at the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, vast and untamed. Roman sat beside her, silent. "Do you regret it?" she asked finally. Roman turned to her. "Regret what?" "Choosing me." He exhaled, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "If I hadn't, you wouldn't be alive." Ellie studied him. "That's not an answer." Roman hesitated, then met her gaze. "No," he said softly. "I don't regret it." Ellie's breath caught. She looked away. "I don't know what happens now." Roman leaned back. "Then we figure it out." She turned back to him. "Together." Roman's lips twitched slightly. "Together." Silence stretched between them, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It was warm, hopeful. Ellie had once thought Roman Lancaster was her prison, but now she realized something terrifying. He might just be her home, and for the first time in her life. That didn't scare her. It felt like freedom.